My brothers, my sisters, my elders, lean in with me for a moment. Let us slow the noise of the world and listen to the quiet truth rising beneath it. Something is shifting across the warm waters of the Caribbean, something that carries the same weight, the same trembling energy that our parents once felt during the freedom marches and the long nights in wooden church halls. A change is moving, not with the sound of drums nor the cry of wind, but with the steady heartbeat of a people who have finally said, enough. For decades, the Caribbean has been spoken over, spoken for, and spoken around. Today, it is beginning to speak for itself, and the world, my elders, is startled. A door is opening, a tide is turning, and whether we like it or not, history has stepped onto the stage once more. Before we begin this journey together, I invite you with respect, with care, with gratitude to subscribe to this channel, so you never miss these deep conversations meant especially for our community, especially for those who carry wisdom in their years. Now breathe in, because what you are about to hear may surprise you. My elders, let us settle ourselves and walk together into the heart of this unfolding story. For many years, the Caribbean Sea has carried the whispers of quiet disappointment. Governments changed, flags flew, speeches came and went, yet the everyday people in Kingston, Port of Spain, Castries, Bridgetown, and Nassau felt something heavy lingering in the air. It was the weight of promises made by Western powers which arrived slowly, and the weight of demands which always seemed to arrive quickly. It was the burden of being treated as a strategic outpost, rather than a living community of families, fishermen, teachers, and old mothers praying on their verandas at sunset. Then came Hurricane Melissa, a storm that tore through the islands with a force that shook not only buildings, but confidence. The winds ripped roofs from homes, but they also tore the veil from old illusions. Caribbean elders looked around and saw once more that in their hour of need, the world's richest nations offered speeches before they offered help, and paperwork before they offered dignity. My brothers and sisters, you know this pattern, for you have lived long enough to recognize its shape. Yet something unusual began to happen in the days that followed. Across the islands, inside small wooden churches, on street corners, in community centers with cracked white paint, people were watching one particular African leader. Some had never heard his name before the storm. Others had caught glimpses of him in short clips shared by their grandchildren. But after Melissa, the attention sharpened. They saw Ibrahim Traoré, Captain Traoré, speaking with a voice that did not tremble in front of Western cameras. They saw the young captain raising questions that elders had carried privately for 50 years. They saw the Burkina Faso leader telling his people, and the world, that sovereignty is not something to be requested politely. It is something to be lived boldly. And that was when many Caribbean communities experienced what social media later called the Ibrahim Traoré moment. It was the instant when people realized that the tone of global leadership did not have to be submissive to the old colonial centers. They saw a West African officer who refused to bow. They saw a man who did not speak in riddles or half-truths, but in the simple language of dignity. Caribbean elders recognized that rhythm, for it was the same rhythm that once lived in Marcus Garvey, in Walter Rodney, in Michael Manley, in every preacher who ever said, "Stand tall, child of the sun." In Jamaica, a retired teacher told her church circle, "This young man speaks as our fathers spoke." In Dominica, a fisherman listening to his radio at dawn said, "He not afraid of them." Imagine that. In St. Vincent, a group of mothers preparing food for families displaced by the storm whispered among themselves, Why our leaders never talk so strong. These were not political statements. These were heart statements. Then, almost silently, the region began doing something that Western analysts did not expect. The Caribbean began watching Africa with curiosity instead of distance. They asked questions that had not been asked in generations. What would partnership look like if it were not defined in Washington or London? What would development look like if it were shaped between islands and continents that share a lineage, rather than between nations that once controlled and extracted? What would self-respect look like if everyone from the farmer in St. Lucia to the grandmother in Haiti believed they had a rightful voice in global affairs? Meanwhile, across the ocean, the young captain in Burkina Faso continued to speak boldly. When he addressed his people about rebuilding, about honor, about refusing exploitation, many Caribbean listeners felt the echo in their own bones. They remembered their own past leaders who tried to take similar stands, only to be undermined by external pressure, destabilized by foreign interference, or punished economically. This shared memory created a strange, quiet bridge between Caribbean elders and the Burkina Faso leader. They sensed he was standing on battlefields their own ancestors once walked. Churches across the Caribbean began discussing his speeches during midweek prayer meetings. Barbershops in Miami, Atlanta, and Brooklyn filled with Caribbean and African American elders replayed his words, while customers nodded slowly as if tasting something familiar. Even some local councilors and former ministers in the islands began referencing his tone when discussing national pride. The shift was small at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew. It became a murmur. Then it became a conversation, and soon it became a realization. The Caribbean was no longer looking only west. It was beginning to look south. It was beginning to look across the Atlantic, not with longing, but with recognition. For the first time in many decades, Africa and the Caribbean were observing each other not as distant relatives, but as possible partners in a world growing restless under old hierarchies. Yet what truly startled global observers was not the admiration. It was the timing. The storm had exposed the fragility of old arrangements, and the young captain had offered a new language of courage. These two forces collided in the hearts of Caribbean people, creating a moment the West did not anticipate and could not easily control. And my elders, this rising energy carried a question that no Western diplomat was ready to answer. What happened next forced the most powerful governments to realize that the Caribbean's awakening was no longer a rumor, but a turning tide. My elders, when the tide first began to shift, the world did not feel the movement. Great powers seldom notice a tremor beneath their feet until the ground already begins to crack. But the Caribbean felt it. The islands understood that something was changing inside their own people, inside their own elders, inside the memories that had been carried for more than 5 decades. Yet there was one moment, one spark, one startling turn that transformed a quiet murmur into a rising chorus. And that moment came from the voice of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. It happened during a speech that was not meant for the Caribbean at all. The Burkina Faso officer was speaking to his own citizens, standing before a crowd gathered in the heat of an unforgiving Sahel afternoon. His tone was firm, his posture unbending, his conviction unmoved by the pressure that surrounded him. When a foreign journalist asked a question meant to corner him, the young captain responded with a calm that carried the weight of an entire generation. He spoke not of Western approval, but of African destiny. He spoke of purpose rather than permission. He spoke of freedom as though it were a living fire. That clip traveled across the ocean, and elders in Kingston and Port of Spain watched him with widened eyes. Church communities in St. Kitts replayed the clip after evening prayer. Caribbean nurses working night shifts in New York passed it from phone to phone during their short breaks. There was something in the West African leader's tone that stirred an old ache within the diaspora, the ache of recognition. His words did not sound rehearsed or conditioned. They sounded like the truth spoken without fear. And then came what many islanders later called the Ibrahim Traoré reaction, the exact instant when his firm refusal to bow to Western pressure struck a deep, resonant chord across the Caribbean. He did not shout. He did not tremble. He simply stood his ground with the dignity of a revolutionary soldier who had already counted the cost and accepted it. That composure, that steady fire, reminded elders of a time when men like Walter Rodney stood before larger powers and refused to bend. It reminded Jamaicans of Michael Manley's call for equality. It reminded Trinidadians of the Black Power movement of 1970. It reminded Haitians of those brief, hopeful years when their voice tried to rise before being forced down again. For the Caribbean, this was not about politics. This was about memory. It was about the dignity their parents had been denied. It was about the promises of independence that never arrived in full. It was about the feeling, deep inside their bones, that true freedom had always been kept just beyond reach. So when the Burkina Faso head of state raised his voice and said that no nation should control the destiny of another, Caribbean elders whispered, "We know that pain. We have lived that truth." What surprised Western observers was not the admiration that followed, but its speed. Within days, Caribbean commentators were discussing the young captain on radio stations. Journalists in Barbados and Jamaica asked why the region had not developed the same courage to confront certain unjust arrangements. Trinidadian elders held roundtable discussions in community halls, remembering the times their own leaders attempted bold reforms only to be punished by foreign forces. And Haitian scholars compared his tone to the strength once seen in leaders who resisted long-term economic manipulation. Across the United States, in cities with large Caribbean populations, the reaction grew even louder. Barbershops in Washington, Miami, and Philadelphia replayed his speeches, while elders said things they had not spoken aloud in years. Some said, "This is the voice our islands needed but never received." Others said, "He is speaking what we have whispered." And a few, with tears welling in their eyes, said, "We thought men like this were gone." Yet admiration alone was not the climax. The turning point came when a confidential briefing, prepared by a Western think tank, quietly circulated among politicians in Europe and North America. The report stated plainly that the Caribbean was experiencing an ideological awakening, fueled partly by the bold speeches of the West African leader. It warned that if the islands grew closer to Africa, the geopolitical balance in the Western Hemisphere could shift dramatically. It stated that the Caribbean was no longer a secure sphere of influence, and that its people were finding emotional and cultural alignment beyond traditional partners. That phrase, emotional and cultural alignment, was the first sign that powerful governments understood the magnitude of the shift. It was not economic pressure that was changing the Caribbean. It was dignity. It was memory. It was the awakening of a people who had been overlooked for too long. Suddenly, Western ambassadors began making unexpected visits to Caribbean capitals. Aid packages were discussed with unusual urgency. Policies that had been delayed for decades were now revisited with remarkable speed. But the elders of the islands could see through it. They recognized the timing. They recognized the fear behind the sudden generosity. They understood that the world was not offering kindness. It was offering compensation to avoid losing influence. Yet the Caribbean was thinking for itself now. The elders were asking new questions. The young were talking differently. The islands were listening to Africa with open hearts. And all the while, somewhere in Burkina Faso, the young captain continued to speak with the same steady fire, unaware that his words had awakened a tide across an ocean. But what followed next would reveal consequences far greater than admiration, consequences that would ripple through economies, alliances, and the very identity of the Caribbean itself. My elders, when a people awaken, the world trembles. And when the Caribbean began to open its eyes fully, recognizing its own strength, dignity, and shared lineage with the continent across the Atlantic, consequences flowed like a river breaking free from an old dam. These consequences did not arrive with trumpet blasts or breaking headlines. They arrived as quiet shifts inside governments, as discomfort inside Western ministries, and as confidence inside the hearts of island elders who had waited many decades for such a moment. The first consequence came during a gathering of Caribbean ministers after Hurricane Melissa. While the official agenda focused on infrastructure and recovery, an unspoken subject hung in the room. Members whispered discreetly about the speeches of Captain Traoré. Several officials shared stories of ordinary citizens referencing the Burkina Faso leader in community meetings. The region had not seen such unified interest in an African head of state in many decades. Some ministers, especially from smaller island nations, admitted that traditional aid partners had been slow, conditional, or dismissive. They questioned whether continuing along the same path served the long-term dignity of their people. Then came the second consequence, revealed through a leaked briefing sent to a Caribbean Economics Council. The document warned that reliance on a narrow group of Western lenders placed the islands in a fragile position. It recommended exploring diversified partnerships, including African-led development frameworks. This was the first time an official Caribbean document mentioned Africa not as a cultural attachment, but as an economic alternative. The young captain in Burkina Faso had not proposed such a thing, yet his unapologetic stance reawakened the Caribbean's curiosity about sovereignty-based cooperation. The third consequence unfolded in the streets, far from conference halls. Caribbean elders, Caribbean youth, Caribbean workers in overseas diasporas began speaking about self-determination with a boldness not commonly heard since the 1970s. In St. Lucia, a fishermen's association called for reviewing maritime contracts with foreign corporations. In Barbados, students at a university debated the strategic future of the region, questioning whether the islands could form stronger South-South alliances. In Haiti, activists discussed the historical extraction that had drained their nation for more than a century, pointing out parallels with West African nations. They spoke softly, but their words carried the weight of truth. My brothers and sisters, consequences do not always strike like lightning. Sometimes they arrive as a change in posture, a change in tone, a change in what a people believe they deserve. And across the Caribbean, people began to believe they deserved more than symbolic friendships with powerful nations. They deserved partnerships grounded in respect, not hierarchy. This awakening caused unease in Western capitals. Diplomats visited the region with unusual frequency. Promises of new funding suddenly appeared. Negotiations that had been stagnant for years were revived. Yet Caribbean elders saw the timing clearly. They knew the motivation was not compassion, but concern. They understood that the world was reacting not to a storm, but to a shift in the Caribbean spirit. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the West African officer continued his work. The Burkina Faso head of state spoke about agricultural rebirth, economic resistance, and unity among African nations. He did not speak for the Caribbean, yet his message echoed there. His unapologetic tone reminded islanders of struggles their ancestors had endured. His defiance reminded them of times when island leaders were punished for resisting foreign manipulation. Caribbean elders recognized this pattern and saw in him the reflection of their own unhealed history. As these consequences spread, a fourth development emerged. Latin American nations, especially those advocating for a multipolar world, began expressing support for Caribbean autonomy. Ministers in Central and South America invited Caribbean delegations to discuss energy, trade, and climate resilience without dependency on the old economic gatekeepers. This was subtle, but it was enough to make Western policymakers uneasy. Their backyard, as some once called it, was beginning to think, move, and choose independently. Inside Caribbean households, conversations changed. Families spoke of historical debts unpaid. Elders recalled the destabilizations of the 1970s. Young people questioned why their islands remained shackled to the same financial structures that had failed them for decades. Church pastors preached sermons about dignity, warning their congregations that a nation that forgets its worth eventually loses its voice. Mothers told their children stories of ancestors who crossed the Atlantic against their will, and fathers reminded them that their heritage was larger than the borders drawn by imperial powers. The consequence most feared by external actors, however, was not political or economic. It was emotional. Caribbean people were beginning to feel closer to Africa, not out of nostalgia, but out of shared experience, shared struggle, and shared hope. The emotional thread connecting island villages to West African towns had been dormant, but never severed. And the rise of a leader who spoke boldly revived that thread. And so, my elders, the Caribbean stood at a crossroads. The consequences of this awakening were now undeniable. The region was thinking differently, questioning old structures, imagining new ones. Western governments sensed the shift, but could not reverse it. The islands had tasted the idea of dignity, and once a people taste it, they rarely go back. Yet one final question began to rise from the lips of elders and the hearts of the young. If the Caribbean embraced its full voice, how would the world respond? For the next chapter would reveal that the global reaction to this awakening was far more complex, far more strategic, and far more revealing than anyone expected. My elders, when the Caribbean began to stir with new conviction, it was not only the islands that felt the tremor. Across oceans and continents, governments, think tanks, and intelligence agencies adjusted their instruments, trying to measure a movement that did not follow the familiar patterns of politics. This awakening was not driven by party alliances or trade disputes. It was driven by memory, dignity, and a rediscovered kinship stretching across the Atlantic. And so, as the Caribbean's inner fire grew stronger, the world leaned in to listen. In the United States, policymakers reacted first with disbelief, then with discomfort. For more than a century, Washington had assumed that the Caribbean's orientation would remain predictable. But as families in Kingston, Bridgetown, and Port of Spain began embracing their own voice, American analysts sensed something had shifted. Reports circulated quietly through federal offices, warning that the islands were reevaluating their strategic dependencies. One document even noted that the speeches of Captain Traoré, though directed at African realities, had created symbolic resonance throughout the Caribbean. This phrase troubled officials, for symbolism often becomes influence long before anyone realizes it. In Europe, especially among former colonial powers, the response was marked by a peculiar mixture of nostalgia and anxiety. Some European diplomats hoped the Caribbean's emotional shift would fade, believing it to be a temporary reaction to hardship. But others, more experienced and more honest, admitted that the islands were entering a new era of introspection. When the Burkinabe leader demanded fair treatment on the world stage, European commentators debated quietly behind closed doors, wondering if the Caribbean would follow a similar path. Their concern was not merely political, it was historical. For if the Caribbean embraced full autonomy in spirit as well as structure, Europe's traditional influence in the region would diminish dramatically. Moving eastward, global powers like China and India observed the change with great interest. These nations had long sought relationships beyond Western systems, and the Caribbean's shifting posture offered new opportunities. Indian diplomats spoke of cultural bridges dating back centuries. Chinese analysts emphasized South-South cooperation. Yet even as they prepared proposals and initiatives, they understood something critical. The Caribbean's newfound voice was not looking to replace one master with another. It was seeking genuine partnership, not strategic dependence. Latin America, sharing both geography and historical struggle, responded with empathy. Ministers from neighboring nations expressed solidarity with the islands, praising their courage to speak freely. They recognized the familiar pattern. Nations forced to navigate the pressures of global politics while yearning for sovereignty shaped by their own people. But beneath all these reactions, one truth united the world's capitals. The Caribbean's awakening was not a small ripple. It was a sign of deeper tides. A leader in a distant Sahel nation had spoken boldly, and his voice had awakened something profound in the hearts of islanders whose histories had long been intertwined with resistance. The world understood what was rising, even if it did not yet know how to contain it. And so came the final question, the one that would determine the future. With the world watching and the islands awakening, which path would the Caribbean choose next? My elders, when a people begin to reclaim their voice, they eventually reach the point where silence is no longer possible. And that is where the Caribbean now stands, at a crossroads shaped not by foreign architects, but by the heartbeat of its own sons and daughters. The winds that once carried hesitation now carry possibility, and the sea that once separated continents now feels like a bridge calling the islands to step forward with courage. The first path before the Caribbean is the one most familiar, to continue the long-standing relationship with Western nations, hoping that renewed promises will bring renewed respect. Some leaders argue that stability lies in continuity, that the systems which shape the past must shape the future. Yet many elders remember that continuity often came with conditions, and that respect was offered slowly, if at all. The question remains, can the old pattern suddenly transform into something truly fair? The second path is a bold reimagining, a shift toward a multipolar world in which the Caribbean shapes its own alliances based on mutual dignity rather than inherited obligation. This path invites cooperation with Latin America, Asia, and new global actors. It encourages the islands to build bridges not because they are pressured, but because they choose freely. It asks the Caribbean to define its worth on its own terms, something elders across the region have prayed for through many decades of hardship and hope. The third path is the most emotionally charged, a deepening of relations with Africa, built not on sentiment alone, but on shared experience, shared ancestry, and shared future. The speeches of Captain Traoré, though directed at his own people, awakened an awareness in the islands that the Atlantic does not divide a family. It connects one. Caribbean thinkers now explore agricultural partnerships with West African states. Educators imagine exchanges between island students and African universities. Activists dream of cultural festivals celebrating a unity that was forbidden for centuries. And yet, my brothers and sisters, the road ahead is not merely strategic, it is spiritual. For the Caribbean's decision will determine not only its economic direction, but its identity. The young captain in Burkina Faso reminded the world that sovereignty is not a document, it is a posture. It is the way a people stand when confronted with power. His voice rekindled something deep in the Caribbean soul, but the islands must choose their path for themselves. No leader, no movement, no storm can choose it for them. Still, one truth remains constant. The Caribbean can no longer return to the days when its destiny was shaped in distant capitals. The elders of the islands have tasted a new clarity, and the youth have sensed a new horizon. Whether the region chooses continuity, independence, or reconnection, the world will have to face a Caribbean that knows its worth. And so, my elders, we arrive at the threshold of the final question. What future will the Caribbean claim now that its voice has awakened and the world has begun to listen? My elders, as we reach the closing of this journey, let us breathe slowly and feel the weight of everything the Caribbean has endured, everything Africa has survived, and everything the global Black family continues to rise above. For the story unfolding today is not merely political, it is generational, it is spiritual. It is the long echo of ancestors who crossed vast oceans in chains, only to watch their descendants stand tall in spite of every storm. The awakening that has shaken the Caribbean did not begin with a single leader. Yet the courage of Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain from Burkina Faso, has undeniably become a symbol of a deeper truth waiting to be spoken aloud. Across islands and diaspora cities, elders have witnessed more than one Ibrahim Traoré moment. They have seen confidence returning to communities once silenced. They have seen young people searching for dignity rather than permission. They have seen the old fear crumble beneath the steady conviction of a new generation. And many have felt in their bones that the Ibrahim Traoré reaction was not simply about resisting Western pressure. It was about reminding oppressed peoples that they are worthy of self-respect. Yet, my brothers and sisters, the most powerful Ibrahim Traoré moment is not the one that happened in front of cameras. It is the one happening quietly inside the hearts of Caribbean families, African American elders, and West African communities who now see one another more clearly than before. This is the moment when fragmented histories begin to realign. This is the moment when scattered voices begin to harmonize. This is the moment when dignity feels less like a distant promise and more like a living inheritance. And so we stand at a threshold. The future of the Caribbean will not be dictated by old empires or new superpowers. It will be shaped by the choices of the islands themselves, by the courage of their leaders, and by the clarity of their people. The question that remains is simple, yet profound. Will the Caribbean dare to claim the destiny that history once denied? My elders, I invite you now to speak. Do you believe unity between Africa, the Caribbean, and the global diaspora can rise in our lifetime? Share your wisdom in the comments, for your voice guides the next generation. And if this message spoke to your spirit, I kindly ask you to subscribe, to stay with this community, and to walk with us as we continue telling the stories that others prefer to ignore. The future is calling, the tide is turning, and the islands are finally listening to their own heartbeat.